Beyond the City Limits, the show that provides you with information about the people, places, and events that shape the character of our community. As a follow-up show, we're joined here today with Molly Butterworth. Hi, Molly.
Good morning.
Nice to see you again.
Good to see you too.
And we're going to follow up with the show we had a couple weeks ago where we showed the Auto Museum. Now we're going to see the Rescue Museum out here. We're out here at the Museum of Transport, which is St. Louis County Museum, and it's in unincorporated county, I think you told me last
Correct.
time. Where exactly is the address out here?
Our address is 3015 Barrett Station Road. We're sort of right between Des Peres, Kirkwood, and Valley Park. Well, they all join together. We're right in the middle of that.
Very good. And we're going to look at the trains and so on. And this is one of the largest collections of trains in the United States, isn't it?
It is. We are a fantastic, very diverse, and very large transportation museum, but really the railroad collection is at the heart of our museum. The museum was founded in 1944 with largely the trains in mind, and as such, the collection was built in a magnificent and large scale at a time when railroads were going to the diesel locomotives. We have a fantastic steam locomotive collection and really a great, rich collection all the way around.
Oh, great. Well, as they used to say, all aboard. Let's go take a look. Okay, what do we have here, Molly?
We have a fantastic steam locomotive here from the Midwest at the beginning of the locomotive collection. This is a Chicago and Illinois Midland freight steam locomotive built in 1928, and it's a great example of a regular freight locomotive. This did not pull passenger trains, but freight. It is powerful, strong, and for that time, very reliable.
Looks like a huge train with the 4 pulling wheels. I mean, that's kind of unusual, other than there's one they used to have out there called Big Boy. I assume it's still out there. I'm sure
It
we'll
is
take a look at here.
and it is a little bigger. This is a 282 Mikado type steam locomotive, and when I say 282, that refers to 2 lead wheels, 8 driving wheels, and then 2 trailers. And the trailers actually sit underneath the cab in which the engineer and the conductor rode, the engineer and the fireman.
Okay, and this, I assume the tender behind the engine or behind the locomotive is where the water is and so on?
The water and whatever the fuel source might have been. For the early locomotives, that was wood. Eventually it went to coal, and then the later locomotives, before we switched over to diesel, actually used oil in their cabs as part of the early firing system, but they were usually either coal or wood.
Very good. Okay.
Right next to the Chicago and Illinois Midland locomotive, we have another Midwestern locomotive built only 10 years later, again for a Midwestern Railroad, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. This is the Silver Charger. It was built by the Budd Company. Budd became famous for building stainless steel clad passenger cars that looked very much like this locomotive. 8 of these type locomotives were built for the Burlington Railroad. The first, the Pioneer Zephyr, is actually on exhibit at a museum in Chicago. Fantastic exhibit. This is the last of the 8 that was built, the Silver Charger. This regularly did service between St. Louis and Hannibal each day. Early on, it pulled 3 cars that looked just like it. They were stainless, Budd-built cars. Later in its life, those cars moved on, and it pulled 3 heavyweight Burlington cars behind it. We now have 3 heavyweight Burlington cars on exhibit behind it.
Okay, now this one is a little bit different in the drive, and it's got drive wheels in the front and the back, I assume?
It does. Being a diesel locomotive, it completely got away from the type of wheel arrangement we saw in the steam locomotives. Diesel locomotives don't have drivers, the big tall wheels. They don't have a trailing truck. They don't have a pilot truck. They have truck sets. And usually those truck sets are identical, front and back. These bigger locomotives often had 3 wheel sets in the trucks, and that would be a 6-axle. Later, and you'll see this on most of the freight locomotives you see today, there are 4-axle trucks, or 4-wheel trucks, and those have 2 axles on them. So this was actually a little bit bigger because this was 6.
We're on the other side of the lower level now, and what is this engine?
This is a Frisco steam locomotive built in 1918 by Baldwin Locomotive Works. Ironically, we're on the 8 theme here. We started off with 1928, went to 1938, now we're back to 1918. This is a fascinating locomotive because these locomotives were originally built by Baldwin for Imperial Russia. They never made the transition to Russia, and the gauges of the wheels actually had to be changed to meet the American standard gauge railroad size, but they ended up being very successful railroad pieces for both the Frisco Railroad and the other railroads that bought them from the Baldwin Locomotive Works.
Okay, and you were mentioning this probably went between St. Louis and Springfield?
Yes, that was a common freight route for the Frisco Railroad, St. Louis down to Springfield and back.
Okay. It's a very interesting locomotive. And I see we have a bird's nest in there, a family living in there. So
We are.
it's still serving a very useful purpose.
We are very friendly as a St. Louis County park to all of our wildlife, and with it being springtime, it is bird nesting time here at the museum, and they, like we do, pick their favorite locomotives. So this is a decapod favor.
Okay, Molly, now we're at a very colorful railroad car.
We are, and we're at one that has a fascinating, again, natural name. We call this the whale belly because if you look at this car in profile, it does look like a big whale belly hanging down in the middle between the trucks. This is actually the largest tank car ever built for railroading. This one carried anhydrous ammonia, and it worked very well for that, but the American Association of Railroads instituted a length limit for freight cars. This car was actually too long, so these cars had to be retired, and we now have on exhibit the largest tank car ever built in the world, the whale belly.
The whale belly. It's a unique name. It's very colorful.
And memorable.
And memorable. Now, here's another very interesting car.
This is a fascinating car, and it's the only one of its type that survives. This is an open-sided, tri-level car carrier, very fitting for the Museum of Transportation. This was operated and owned by the Frisco Railroad. It ran out of St. Louis. It carried 3 levels of new passenger cars on it, which was a fascinating thing to see, but unfortunately those cars could all too easily be vandalized and damaged. So that's why we no longer have open car carriers.
Okay, well, what my first thought was that the cars on top could suddenly become convertibles. Those low bridges and stuff.
As tall as this car is, it would fit under everything but very, very old tunnels, one of which we have here at the museum. But it was actually short enough to be able to fit under all the other overpasses. I still would not want my car on top of it, though.
No.
If my new car were riding up there, I'd be a little bit nervous.
It does look like it's a lot larger than current car carriers, too.
It is. It carried. It is. It's both longer and taller. It carried more cars than our modern car carriers do, which are enclosed and safer for the cars.
Okay, here we are at another interesting 1920s locomotive.
We are. Only 5 of these locomotives were built. This is the only one that survives. This was built by General Electric for pulling passenger trains through the Cascade Mountains for the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific. Either steam in the early days or later diesel locomotives would pull the passenger trains up to the mountains. Then these electric locomotives would run pulling the passenger cars through the mountains using some overhead lines. And the fascinating thing about this locomotive, we have a picture from 1926, I believe, of Thomas Edison doing this, looking at the electricity underneath the locomotive.
Oh.
So this locomotive was famous before it even got here to the museum.
Now, where's the Cascade Mountains? I'm sure somewhere in Wisconsin. I've never heard of them.
The Cascades are actually out west. They are in the northwest. They're roughly between, they're sort of before you get to Montana, but they're on the edge as you head out west on your way to Seattle.
Oh, okay. Kind of part of the Rocky Mountains, or
Right.
outcropping of the Rocky
The northern
Mountains.
edge of the Rockies in the United States.
Very interesting. See, I learned something new today.
A little bit of geography here at the museum. We are all about transportation and places we get to go with the transportation.
There you go. Okay, let's move on to the next exhibit. Okay, here we are at another interesting aspect of the museum. the railroad tunnel.
We are, and actually we are looking at the reason the Museum of Transportation is right here. We are located at the West Barrett's Tunnel. There are two Barrett's tunnels, one east, which is on the way into Kirkwood, and one out here west, which is on the Museum of Transportation's property. These are the first two railroad tunnels west of the Mississippi River. They were used by the Pacific Railroad starting in 1853 after James Kirkwood, for whom the city of Kirkwood is named, designed the two tunnels, and crews came in to build them. They were fascinating tunnels, great tunnels, unfortunately very limestone based and occasionally prone to falling in when moisture would get embedded in the limestone. That had happened enough by World War II, and the two single track tunnels had become enough of a traffic constriction point by World War II and the war traffic that the Missouri Pacific Railroad blasted out the hillside on either side of the tunnels and built a new double track main, which is what we have today. At that point, the Museum of Transportation moved to this site in 1946 because this tunnel was surplus and there was no traffic here anymore, just on the mainline railroad. So this tunnel is the reason we are out here.
Okay, now this tunnel is not used anymore. Like if you bring trains in here, if you add to your collection, they come on the main, or do they come through the tunnel?
They do. They come on the main line. The tunnel is disconnected at the very back. It has some rocks on the western end of it, and the track line is cut out underneath it.
Make it very difficult to run a train on it, for sure.
It would. I have run one of our diesel locomotives in here, and it's great, but a little bit nerve-wracking knowing it's very tight, over a century and a half old, and could cave in at any time. So it's not a very reassuring feeling, but it is exciting.
Not a good thing.
Right.
Okay, let's move on to the Frisco train here.
What we have here is called the Katy Flyer. It's actually a steam locomotive and a set of passenger cars from the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, which was a local railroad, local west and south. It was a fascinating railroad, but this set is actually fascinating in and of itself because this was a promotional set for the Katy. They steamed it around in the late 1940s and early 1950s with the freight cars behind it, sort of advertising the railroad. This is one of the few steam locomotives that came into the museum under its own power. It was not towed here. It ran into the museum carrying its own freight cars, and it retired literally right here at the museum.
Retired. Okay, so its last trip was here.
Its last trip, and we plan to keep it, so that's its once and final trip.
Yeah.
But it's still in such great shape. We have actually considered this through the years for a rebuild to operation because the railroad did so much work to it to make it its promotional locomotive. Then they just ran it a couple of thousand miles and retired it here at the museum. So even though the parts are now a half century old, they're still in great shape.
So it's usable, in other words.
It is.
So that'd be great. Well, if you ever get it fired up, let me know. I'd like a ride on it.
We will. There's nothing like riding in a steam locomotive, especially a local historic one.
Okay, here we have some volunteers trying to restore an engine, correct?
We do. We are so grateful for our volunteers. Last year, they contributed over 35,000 hours of free, valuable, important time to the museum. One of the most important things they do is restoration of our collection. These people, who largely are professionals from other workplaces and other divisions of work, volunteer here at the museum to do things like weld, paint, scrape, rivet, woodworking. It's really incredible, and we're very, very grateful and thankful for their help because we depend upon them so much in so many ways.
This engine they're working on is one of my favorites. We talked about a little bit earlier, Big Boy. Talk about Big Boy a little bit.
This is the Union Pacific Big Boy. The Big Boy freight locomotives were the largest successful steam locomotives ever built. We are very lucky to have one here at the museum because they're famous locomotives. They have so much power. They had a fair amount of speed for mostly the flatlands the Union Pacific serviced, and we're really grateful to have one here at the museum. Ours is number 4006.
Okay, and this is a 244. What?
This is a 2448.
2448. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's got 8 drive wheels, right?
Yes.
So
And
it's
it actually,
huge engine.
it is, and it actually bends a little bit in the middle. That's why it's articulated. The locomotive can actually separate its boiler from the wheels. So when you see this turning on a sharp curve, you can see the wheels, if it's a right-hand curve, the wheels are headed right while the locomotive boiler is still angled off a little bit to the left. So the articulation helped this locomotive get around the tight curves. The bigger issue with this locomotive was not the engine itself, but actually the tender, because all the wheels on the tender are symmetrical and they're right together, locked together. So if anything were to derail in this locomotive, it would be the tender, not the wheels, the locomotive itself.
Okay. And this thing has got to be a tremendous amount of weight.
It carried over 25,000 gallons. It's almost 140 feet long, and it weighs over 600 tons.
Oh my gosh. Very huge engine. But this has always been my favorite. When I was a much younger kid coming out here, this was my favorite engine.
Like I said, this is one of our most popular ones. When the History Channel came out wanting to film our big boy in action, I was the lucky or unlucky person running the diesel locomotive behind it to move it back and forth. I previously mentioned how the tender would often derail. I know that from personal experience because I derailed it on camera for the History Channel. But I still love this locomotive.
Yeah. I'm surprised a diesel switch engine would be able to pull this.
It is on flat ground, but we had to use our biggest diesel switch locomotive, which was a former Army engine, so it was used to pulling many heavy things.
I can imagine. Okay, let's go to the next exhibit. Okay, behind you we have a very interesting locomotive. It looks like it predates a lot of these other ones.
It is. We've just gone from our biggest locomotive, the big boy, to our oldest locomotive, the Daniel Nason, built for the Boston and Providence Railroad between 1858 and 1863. It's a fantastic pre-Civil War piece. Not World War I or World War II, Civil War. So that gives you an idea of how old this locomotive is.
Now, where was the railroad? Was it in Boston, Massachusetts area?
Yes, it was. It was an East Coast railroad. And one interesting thing about this locomotive, it's actually the nickname for it is a Dutch wagon. This was a pre-war design, and this is one of the only surviving Dutch wagons in the world. The Dutch wagon design was already out of date by the time this locomotive was designed and started in 1858, but they went ahead and stuck with the inside connected Dutch wagon design.
And a lot of these, I noticed, they have something that comes down by the wheels. I assume that's where they drop sand and stuff and get traction?
To get traction, exactly. And even modern locomotives still have that. They don't really need that at high speed usually, but switching in yards, when they get started, sometimes if they're heading uphill or have huge weights behind them, they do need the sand drop.
Oh, very interesting. This is a unique design, much different if you look at the other locomotive, more rounded, more aerodynamic. This is kind of a flat station wagon type, you know.
It is. The speeds were much slower and the weights were much lower back then. You can see it's a much smaller boiler and smaller cab, but really big smokestack up front. That's part of the aesthetics of these old locomotives, as well as the paint scheme. These locomotives were more colorful than they were in the more modern, just black and gray scheme that we saw in later steam locomotives.
And the cowcatcher, as they call the front here, looks like it's got a lot of wood on it instead of metal, and you know, a lot of the other ones.
It does. Back in the day of the early locomotives, they were entirely wood. I think maybe either the cattle were smaller or the locomotives were slower. I'm going to guess a little of both.
Probably one of each.
Built in 1889, this is a slightly newer locomotive than Daniel Nason, but a much smaller one. The Black Diamond, built for the Reading Railroad out east, was built as an inspection locomotive. The way these were used was an inspection crew, normally railroad staff, the uppity-ups in the staff, would ride inside the locomotive cab, which was entirely in walnut and had beautiful leather and cloth upholstery upholstery. These locomotives were so small they could often hire only young men to run them because only young men would fit in the space needed by the firemen to run the steam locomotive in this inspection locomotive. So sometimes they would hire 12, 13-year-old boys to be the engineers of these inspection locomotives.
Oh my gosh. And these, you can tell by the paint scheme that these are kind of the ultra type engines. Where did they put the water and fuel and so I guess in a different car behind it? Or?
This locomotive actually traveled by itself, just didn't travel great distances or haul any cars behind it. So it needed less water, less wood, and it could carry those on board on the locomotive itself.
Okay, and that would certainly decrease the space inside.
Decrease the space inside and also decreases the weight and the versatility of this type of locomotive for certain. But it had a very specific purpose. It did that very well and very elegantly.
Yeah, it looks like it's very, very interesting. That's a unique locomotive. I've never seen one like that before.
It is. We have one of the only surviving inspection locomotives left. This just had a recent restoration, so it's in tip-top shape. We're very proud of the Black Diamond.
Okay, now we move on to a diesel locomotive.
And this is a diesel locomotive. It's also perhaps the most important diesel locomotive in the world. This is the A unit of the 4 locomotive set built by EMD, Electromotive Works, to prove to the railroads that dieselization was the way to go. It was immediately built prior to World War II, and railroads were still almost entirely steam-driven at that point. But EMD knew the future was in dieselization, so they built 4 locomotives, 2 A-type units like this that have the cab, and 2 B units, which are basically, if you look at the locomotive, go a quarter back of its length to where the steps are. If you start immediately behind that and just go to the back of the locomotive, that would be a B unit. It's no cab, just engine only. So it was A, B, B, A, and they loaned those 4 locomotives to the different railroads in the United States, saying, here, try this out, see how you like diesel locomotives. If you like this, come back to us and order your diesel locomotives. That is exactly what happened. A few of the old stalwart steam locomotive railroads stayed steam, but this locomotive was the one just immediately before World War II that proved to the railroads dieselization was the way to go in the future. This locomotive is important, sadly, because it helped kill steam locomotives.
Okay. Now, what are the portholes in the side? Is that just air, or I noticed there's like 4 portholes in it.
The portholes are right beside the locomotive power, the engine inside the engine bay, and they could open the front window for aeration, for ventilation, when the engineers were in working on it, and they could even crack it a little bit while they were going down the road to offer additional cooling. Mostly the fans and the aeration units above the engines did that, but the single window that could open was primarily for the mechanics who would go in and work on the diesel engines.
Make it more comfortable for them when they're working.
Exactly. It's a very tightly fit contraption in there. There isn't much room around these big diesel engines.
Okay, now we're at one of the most interesting things and one of the most useful things for railroads, the passengers, the handling of passengers. What do we have here?
This is a fantastic example of a passenger car, and it's from a local railroad, the Missouri Pacific. This car served what is now the Amtrak line between Kansas City and St. Louis. One of its frequent passengers was Senator, not yet President, but Senator Harry Truman. He would ride home and get off at the Independence station, which still exists to this day. He loved to use this car. It was very comfortable and very private.
It looks like a very elegant, for that time in our history, it looks like a very elegant car.
This was the tail car on the train. We'll see at the very end of it. It had a curved rear end to it. It was the very last car that rode on the train. It was the most expensive to ride. This car had amazing passenger space. You can see how luxurious and comfortable those chairs are. It also had a family room, a family private room, because it made it very useful for the Truman family to rent the room and use it as a group. So they had additional privacy in their own private bedroom.
Now, the other thing I noticed is that the chairs are so low to the ground. The seats, I mean, it's almost like getting in a sports car.
The chairs are very low to the ground, and the overall population here in the United States was a little bit shorter even back then, back before World War II, so that was a little part of it, but having those low chairs made the cars very comfortable in which to ride, because the low chairs sort of compensated for the curving of the railroad lines, and it's like riding a sports car. Low chairs in a sports car, low chairs in the passenger car.
Low center of gravity. In other words, that is a very elegant car. Okay, now we're inside of a passenger car.
We are. This is actually a combine or combination car built for the Boston and Maine Railroad in 1899. So this is a 19th century passenger car we're in. Amazingly, despite its age, it was operated by the Arkansas-Missouri Railroad on its currently operating passenger division until the late 1990s. So at almost a century old, this car was still rolling down the rails carrying visitors.
Be done. Well, it's got, I noticed the stove there, and then when we go back here to the passenger, the seating part, it's just kind of like the Metrolink now. Opposite facing seats.
It is still a very similar design. This is basically coach seating in both light rail vehicles like we have in Metrolink and even heavyweight passenger cars. These seats had backs that would often flip, so you could change the direction of the seats depending upon which direction the car was traveling. But these seats, even though they're regular coach seats, are very comfortable. They're upholstered in velvet, of all things. Again, 19th century.
It's a very unique seating arrangement in that, you know, the seats are all going, on one side of the car they're going mostly all one direction, the other side of the car most of the seats are going the other direction.
We wanted to be able to show visitors railroad can go in any direction you want.
There you go, that's good.
North,
good
south,
point.
east, west, we can change the seats to suit your needs.
Okay, here we have probably a more modern steam locomotive, or at least in a more modern age than some of the earlier ones.
We do. This is a Chesapeake and Ohio Kanawha or Berkshire type steam locomotive with a 284 wheel arrangement built during World War II in 1944. This locomotive is kind of a sentimental favorite of mine because one of the last engineers assigned to this locomotive and her sister, the 2726, wrote us an amazing letter when this locomotive was donated to us. In the letter, he talked about running this locomotive at night, how he was alone with her, and she spoke to him in a language only the two of them understood, how her smokestack fired like a machine gun, how her lights bore perfect holes in the evening night for him. He loved this locomotive so much that even after he retired, he came to the museum to spend some time with her. I love this locomotive in large part because her engineer loved her so much.
Well, I'm sure they become attached. It's like anything else. You work with something every day, you become really attached to it. It's a magnificent locomotive.
These steam locomotives were amazing because as impressive as the diesels are, the diesels didn't live and breathe the way the steam locomotives did. The steam locomotives needed to be fed so carefully. They would, like the engineer said, talk back to you and give you feedback that you didn't see on what we now call in a car the dash. You know, there were no gauges that would tell you, only the sound and the feel of the steam locomotive would tell you. Having been lucky enough to run a steam locomotive out on the main line, I can tell you it's a completely invigorating and personal feeling to have this massive piece of machinery, now over a century old in some cases, speaking to you in a language only you and he or she understand. It's really amazing.
It's a great story. Well, thank you very much for this wonderful tour today, Molly. We really appreciate it. Encourage anybody that has time this summer, bring your kids out here. It's a fantastic exhibit. What are the hours during the summer?
During the summer, we are open 7 days a week. From Monday through Saturday, we're open from 9 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. On Sundays, we're open from 11 till 4 in the afternoon.
Okay, well, very good. Well, I encourage you to come out here and see this beautiful exhibit. It's something unique to St. Louis County, and it's something that's right in your own backyard. You can spend a day out here and learn a lot of stuff. Thank you for watching our show. If you have any questions, For comments, please contact me at www.cityofblackjack.com or call me at area code 314-355-0400, extension 100. Thank you for watching our show. Good evening.